you rather talk about emotions?
Shopping?
So that practice of taking the mind as the path is still within the realm of Padmasambhava practice, still a shamatha practice. It's amazing. Now, the point of that practice is still ostensibly stability and vividness. And what you really begin to recognize is that when you take these mental appearances as the path, that there's potential for tremendous vividness, because these mental appearances are, it's your mind after all. You're very vividly, brightly engaged with these appearances. So, one of the things about this path of Padmasambhava that is so alluring, I think, is that he lays out a path to shamatha that is inescapably vipassana at the same time. While you are attending to these appearances of the mind, there are some inescapable conclusions. The 3 marks of existence. Are these mental appearances permanent or impermanent? Wow, what could be less permanent than this popcorn in Times Square of the mind? So it just becomes so apparent as a vipassana. And that is the first of the classic vipassana questions. You're analyzing experience in 4 domains with these 3 marks of existence. Are these mental appearances, are tactile sensations permanent or impermanent, etc.? And it may seem like, well, of course, what's the big deal about that? Why? So, yeah, now I have an irrefutable empirical experience. Mental appearances are impermanent. What's the big deal? Whoa. Well, actually, if you really get it, the world changes. What's the big thing about anxiety?
Yeah.
Well, it feels like an anxious thought, anyway, let's just say. I mean, it feels like anxiety is permanent. It feels like depression is permanent. It feels like mental afflictions can be permanent, And so when we see that these are all temporary, very ephemeral events within the space of the mind, everything becomes a lot more workable. You're not dealing with objects any longer. So that is really, it is a big deal to have that empirical, irrefutable evidence right there in front of you that mental appearances are an unchanging thing. And then we can go on from there, but
The mental appearances aren't, did you say unchanging thing?
mental appearances are changing. Did I say unchanging?
I thought so.
Well, thank you for catching that. Yeah, so mental appearances obviously are ephemeral, changing things. So when we then, now we have, that's still within the world of attentional balance, but you begin to see how everything is just this network. It's like an ecosystem of relationships. And so now let's go into examine another of these dimensions of mental balance. And that is the emotional dimension. This is the one that we care so much about. The basic premise, as I mentioned, within this framework of the 4 dimensions of mental balance is that if you take care of the imbalances in the cognitive dimension, the attentional dimension, and your view of the world, cognitive, the emotional dimension will balance itself. The emotional balance is the result of eliminating imbalances in those other three dimensions. And a corollary of that, I guess, is that if you are just focused only on emotional balance, let's say, that's you go to a therapist and because of some destructive emotions or very disturbing emotions, and the whole point is just to work on the emotion. The premise here is that whatever emotional balance that you achieve through that is going to be fleeting and shallow if you don't address the imbalances in the other three dimensions. But nonetheless, there still is a lot to say about this emotional dimension, and we will, begin to explore it a bit anyway. And part of the reason that there is so much to say about it is because of, frankly, I think, the Mind Life conferences now ongoing since 1986, when Francisco Varela was one of the first to have a major dialogue with the Dalai Lama about this world of Western science, the interface of Western science and Tibetan Buddhism. And ever since then, there has been this tremendously fertile dialogue between these two worlds. And so since certain people, characters, beginning with Francisco Varela and Alan Wallace and Richard Davidson, Paul Ekman, etc., got into this whole dialogue with the Dalai Lama, or tremendous things have come out of research. So, for instance, now a lot of Richard Davidson has probably, without doubt, I think according to Alan, the best funded neuroscience lab in the world. Most of it coming from U.S. taxpayers, but it's at at the University of Wisconsin, or University of Wisconsin and Madison. And so a lot of research coming out of that on emotions, destructive emotions, compassion. Paul Ekman, again, one of the collaborators with Alan in this format here that we're discussing and exploring. Tremendous experience resulting from his dialogues with the Dalai Lama about emotions, destructive emotions, and how to actually promote positive emotions of compassion. And now Ekman is doing work on 8 different flavors of compassion, actually. And I can't wait to get into this one. 8 different elements of compassion and what the research may show about different ways of training those different types of compassion. It's just brand new, just in a paper that was presented in Boston. That was my first inkling of it a few months ago. But undoubtedly, I'll be having plenty of questions about that when I get to talk with his daughter anyway about that, who should know something about it. So, one of the interesting things then that the neuroscience has been finding about this dimension of emotions is what a blurry boundary it is between the cognitive and the emotional in the brain, anyway. So areas of the brain that we think of as strictly cognitive, or that formerly were thought of strictly cognitive, like the prefrontal cortex, especially the left prefrontal cortex, have a very important role in emotions and emotional regulation. And so areas, there's just a very blurry distinction neurologically between emotion and the cognitive. And so this can help to explain why emotions really change our perception, can really influence our perception and our thinking. You know what it's like when you're in the grips of a powerful emotion. It has a very definite effect on what you're thinking, how you're thinking, your cognitive processes. Also, that blurry distinction really helps us to understand why the cognitive, why thinking can really change the experience of emotions also, and really lead to taking some control over emotions. How is it, other than through the cognitive, that we are going to really begin to change our emotions and to be able to regulate, take control of our emotional life really? Are we simply victims of our emotional life? If we are going to begin to have some control or some voice in our emotional lives, and the language gets a little dicey there, but you know what I mean. That how is it that we're going to be able to do that other than through cognitive approach? So here we have, again, 3 different ways that the emotional dimension can be imbalanced. There can be a deficit, hyperactivity, and dysfunction. The emotional deficit is basically that flat affect, meaning that I just don't care. Can be a cold indifference. One of the interesting things that Richard Davidson points out in the research has shown recently is that we have often thought of depression as a presence of a very heavy despair, sadness, but a positive, not a positive as in desirable, but something that is there, a presence of these negative emotions. But what the neuroscience is showing is that it seems to be actually also a very important component of the experience is an absence of what we normally feel as everyday positive qualities of pleasure, self-esteem, pride, just everyday positive experiences and inability to feel those. So those would be then, in this framework, that would be an emotional deficit, right? An inability or a flatness, not something that is out of the range of optimal. And emotional hyperactivity imbalance then would be a bipolar oscillation between extremes, emotional extremes. So this could be adulation and loathing, fear and attraction, sadness and elation, etc. It seems like two sides, the opposite sides of the continuum of emotional experience, and often in regard to the same object. So that would be, again, outside of the range of optimal as far as our experience goes. And then dysfunction would be feeling emotions in circumstances that are inappropriate, really. Feeling an emotion that is inappropriate to a particular circumstance is an inappropriate reaction. So sociopaths have that inability, so taking pleasure in what would normally stimulate fear in most of us, etc. Or you can think of Schadenfreude also, that German term that describes the taking pleasure in others' misfortune. And we all may have some degree of that when you go through the checkout line and you see that. I just saw Brad Pitt with a shiner in the checkout line. And I think what the caption was, he was caught in a dalliance with another woman. And I don't know if it was Angie who gave him the punch or whatever, but so if I were taking pleasure in that, I'm not taking pleasure in that because you know, my friend here it's a friend of a friend after all. So, you know, I don't take pleasure in that, but we do have that we can have that reaction, you know, celebrities, oh, I'm glad that, you know, they're unhappy too, or something. Or it can happen to especially people, you know, in our relationship with people that we don't like. I'm glad that that person is having some financial problems. I'm glad that they're getting booted out of their apartment. What a nice development that they got fired. Something like that. So because what we're talking about, the whole framework here is developing authentic happiness, right? And so in this sense then is an emotional balance that is leading towards authentic happiness. And then there are emotional imbalances that are leading away from authentic happiness, contributing to our suffering. And that's what we're really interested in.
Can I ask a question? Why would the hyper be in isolation if the deficit is a flatness? Why can't you say it's someone who's just always disproportionately excitable?
Well, so if that maybe wouldn't be an oscillation then.
Yeah, why is it an oscillation and not the opposite of a flatness?
Oh, just being always distracted by emotion or something? I guess that would be hyperactivity also. Yeah. But so the oscillation, I think, is, I don't know. We'll see as we go along. I don't know that that's such an important point to try to figure out, but this is the way that Alan is describing it, for, you know, as just a wild, basically oscillation between extremes. And what we're trying to do is to, because obviously we're out of control, basically, or those emotions have us in a grip. Yeah, and when we are when they are not in the grip of either extreme, you know, let's say a deep sadness or a wild elation, you know, that bipolar type of response, then there's a sweet spot in our emotional life, I think, is the point. Now, this is very interesting. What do you call it? A field of neuroscience that didn't even exist back in the day when Daniel Goleman published his book, Emotional Intelligence. So I think that was like mid-90s or something. This field wasn't even in existence then, so you couldn't measure it or describe it. But something in the last 20 years or so, 15 years, there's been this whole new field of we'll call it social neurobiology. It basically is the understanding the neuroscience of humans in relationship. And one of the interesting things that has come out of that is that there is one of the very significant ways that our brains are wired is all about relationship and how we can attune ourselves with other people, and how this attunement actually happens, and a movement towards attunement happens in every social interaction that we have. So the question then becomes, we have, let's say, some emotional imbalances. Are these emotional imbalances our private affair? We would like to think so, wouldn't we? That, okay, I'm dealing with some things, but, you know, I'll take care of it, and nobody will get hurt. Nobody will be affected by it. I know rage is an issue, but as long as I don't express it or something, as long as I'm not punching someone, that may be an improvement, but is it our emotional imbalances a private affair? Or do our emotions have a very public life? That's the issue. Well, as it turns out, according to the neuroscience, our emotions are contagious, or emotions are contagious. And we can catch emotions in the same way that we catch a rhinovirus and get a cold. Very interesting that emotions are passed, and they're a large part of the passing of emotions is through what Daniel Goleman calls the low road, meaning that it is below the level of awareness. So these are areas of the brain that we are actually communicating with other people, but we're not cognitively aware of them. So this is a real two-edged sword. You could say that at the end of the day, that the way that you feel, there is an emotional economy. And in a place like New York, where you have many, many interactions during the course of a day, or people who are in the public, people who are caregivers, people who work in helping professions, anybody working in a shop or something, there is a continual stream of social exchanges throughout the day. And at the end of the day, the way that you feel, you could say, is an emotional economy. It's the sum of how your exchanges with people during the day. And some people, and exchanges that you have, you feel good leaving them. You feel an uplift, a positive bounce. Other people, it's draining. You feel sad or whatever, or despair or something, and you may not even know exactly why, but you're just left with that feeling from an interaction. And obviously, the more strongly we're connected with someone, the more powerful that contagion is, the more powerfully we become attuned to someone in a dyad or a triad, even in two or three people in a relationship. One of them will often be the one who is the one setting the emotional tone, and everyone else then catches what this one person is spreading. So this is obviously a two-edged sword. We can, in our positive emotional relationship, a positive emotional milieu that we work in, that we live in, can be very supportive for our health and happiness. A negative emotional milieu can be extremely destructive. And of course, this then leads us all, once we become aware of that, the power of contagion, this really forces us all to assess our own emotional lives, recognizing how important it is for other people. If we really want to, raise your hand and say, I am going to, stop hurting people and start helping people. I'm going to be a bodhisattva. Can we really do that without taking our own emotional lives and our own emotional imbalances into account, recognizing this basic fact now? So here's how important that can be. Epidemiological studies now, a host of them that Richard Davidson cites, indicate that the emotional milieu that you live in or work in actually is a greater determiner of your health than is smoking, high cholesterol, lack of exercise, any of the things that you normally would think of that the Surgeon General would warn you about. All of those things, the emotional milieu that you operate in or that you live in is a greater determinant of major health issues and death. Isn't that interesting? So not only should we be aware of what we're catching from others, but also what we're spreading to others, right? I mean, if we're really going to want to benefit the world, this is why this particular dimension is so important, the emotional. And to stop thinking that I am a victim of my emotions and there's nothing that we can do about it. So this may be one of the more powerful ways, I think, what we're going to be doing next, maybe one of the most powerful ways known to man for actually beginning to take some control, for developing some self-regulation of emotions, and to really begin to feel responsible for the way that you're feeling, recognizing the impact that it has on others. But I want to just, these epidemiological studies again are just so shocking. I have to find this just to make sure I get this exactly right. So one of the most stressful situations is working in a hierarchical organization, where the person at the top is immune from criticism basically and has power and authority. And it's not an uncommon thing, I think, in the hierarchies from what I hear, that, and I was just overheard a long conversation in a restaurant last night about this, that how toxic the work environment was because of the criticism and judgment of the person at the top. So what the epidemiological studies show is that because of the criticism, insults, and judgments that flow only in one direction, from the top down, that people who are at the bottom of a hierarchical organization are 4 times more likely to develop coronary heart disease than people at the top. Wow. Simply because of, and the reason being, according to the studies, because there is no more, as we talked about yesterday, of stress, that the most stressful situation is social judgment. And so when you feel unjustly criticized, but you feel powerless to respond, it is the most difficult, stressful situation, and especially if your job depends on it. The job depends on your holding your tongue. You get this cortisol poisoning, basically. So you get a flood of cortisone, which is an adrenal enzyme, or not an enzyme, but a hormone, that prepares you for fight or flight, and it's constant. So being in that toxic environment then leads to that cortisone imbalance. So for instance, people who have been, one study showed, who have just been criticized and weren't able to respond, maintained this higher level of cortisone, kind of a dangerously high level of cortisone for a full hour before it was able to come back down. And you just feel, if you were just kind of getting that over and over and over again, think of it living in a dangerous situation at home or something like that. Or just, where you were always unsure about how somebody that you cared about was going to be responding to you, or, really, really difficult. So 4 times more likely to develop coronary heart disease. And within a level also of organization, people who were said that their bosses didn't value their opinions, 30% more likely to develop coronary heart disease. So you're talking about serious, serious consequences of being emotionally blind to your own imbalances.
Whose study did you say that was?
What's that?
Daniel Goldman, whose study was that?
Those are all cited by Richard Davidson, yeah, in his book, The Emotional Life of the Brain. And lots of, richly footnoted. So you could, it's difficult to overstate the importance of this emotional domain, or this dimension, the emotional dimension. In fact, when Alan goes on a harangue sometimes, he will point out that it could be that this emotional balance is really going to determine whether we're going to survive as a species, survive the century. I mean, we're not talking long term now, survive the century. So I don't know, could this be true that by 2030 the population of New York will be 18 million? I saw that at MoMA. There was just an exhibit on urban design, and that's what I'm remembering. It seems, wow. So at any rate, the population at the end of the century is going to be somewhere around 11 billion on the planet, right? And so those 11 billion people are going to be competing for a lot fewer resources than what we have right now. And the number of species reduced by 50%. So in the last 40 years, the human population has doubled, and the world wildlife population has been halved. Think there's a correlation there? So what is the outlook for the end of the century if craving and hostility rule the world? I don't know. It seems like this is the key to what the world is going to be like at the end of the century. Can we really begin to balance emotional imbalances? And when you think about emotional imbalances, if we could just eliminate or begin to control two, craving and hostility, how different the world would be. Imagine if it spread like a virus. The freedom from craving and hostility, the kind of, the antidotes to the vaccine, the antidote to craving and hostility, an antibody. Wow, this antibody, it's like in the epidemiological studies of Ebola, where did it start from, and how fast is it spreading? So there's a study out 6 months from now. It seems like there's an antibody to craving and hostility spreading. Where did it come from? It seems to have come from this place in Manhattan. Fourth Avenue. Mm-hmm. Astor Place. We're narrowing it down. It came from somewhere around Astor Place. It seemed to have spread from there. Imagine, because compassion is contagious as well. And that's also what studies indicate, that positive attitudes are contagious as well. So if this is how we really want to influence the world, starting with ourselves is not only the only way, but a very powerful way. What can one person do? Everything. There's nothing that one person can't do. I mean, as a when we begin to aggregate our impact. So craving and hostility, one of the interesting things about the Abhidharma, so the 2nd century system of Buddhist psychology, that is addressing craving and hostility. It describes craving and hostility as a mental factor, two of the 51 mental factors. And these mental factors of craving and hostility, of course, they depend on the delusion of reification, but they also they have two other things that go on with them. So one is reification, meaning that you are seeing, giving concrete existence, perceiving as an object, an event. The other is perceptual bias, meaning that for things you crave, you see only their positive qualities. For things that you loathe or repulse you or you don't like, you see only their negative qualities. When you're in the grips of these afflictions of craving and hostility. So there's a perceptual bias. This comes out, so this is already, about 1,800 years old, this understanding of the human mind. Well, what's very interesting is that one of the really interesting discoveries of Paul Ekman is really regarded as one of the world's leading academic psychologists from the University of California, and a major collaborator in this project, cultivating emotional balance. His research has pointed out. So maybe we should talk actually now, switch gears a little bit to this cognitive dimension. We haven't talked about that. So, because this is really going to illuminate what I was just about to say. Okay, so the cognitive dimension is the way that we see the world. We could call it our worldview, I suppose. But what we are really attempting to do is to view the world truly, in a sense. We'll just put that in quotes. And recognize exactly what the world is presenting to us and what we are overlaying on the world. And so there are, again, deficits. There's a cognitive deficit, meaning that we are not seeing things that are manifestly present. And cognitive hyperactivity would be seeing things that aren't there, or remembering things that never happened. The cognitive deficit, we'll just talk about that one right now, is really interesting, because the thing about cognitive deficit is that you just don't know what you're missing, right? You don't know what you're missing. It's impossible. If you're not perceiving it, you don't know what you're not perceiving until someone points it out to you. There's a very interesting study that was first done in the 1960s at Harvard and has been replicated or redone 3 times since then, and once recently. And this is the famous gorilla in the room study. So the research goes that there are 6 people on a basketball court passing 2 basketballs. And this is being videoed. 6 people passing 2 basketballs. And the job of the research subject is to count the number of passes that are being passed between the 6 people, 2 balls. So it requires a lot of attention because you've got 2 balls in action, right? 4, 5, 6, 7. So this the episode, let's say, lasts several minutes. And sometime during the middle of this, a guy dressed in a gorilla outfit walks onto the basketball court. He pounds his chest, stretches his arms, and he's there for a total of 9 seconds and then walks off. Okay, so you're the research subject. You're viewing this, and your job is to count the number of passes. What are the chances you think that you would see the gorilla? He's there for 9 seconds. What do you think?
100%.
It would seem, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty high.
What about 50? The chances of your seeing it are 50%. If you're, and because this is what the research, 50% of the people who were viewing this didn't see that. So what this is indicate, and the point of the research is that when our attention is focused on a task, we are blind to so many things. And the thing is that we don't know how much we're missing. It's impossible for us to know, isn't it? You don't know what you're missing. How many times have you heard that? Boy, is that true. Of course, come on, I'm just texting. Of course, even though I'm texting, I will see a pedestrian in the crosswalk. You wouldn't know until the collision, right? So that is an example, very dramatic example of cognitive deficit. You don't see what is manifestly there. You are just incapable of seeing it. Okay, now let's go back to emotions. Perceptual bias. How does that influence? How do emotions affect our perception? What Ekman has discovered is something he calls the refractory period. And this is a period of time during which we are under the influence of a strong emotion, during which we are cognitively incapable of perceiving information that contradicts the emotion that we are experiencing. So let's say that you are angry with someone. During the time that you are in the throes of this anger, you are incapable of perceiving any evidence contradicting your anger. Remembering, it's impossible to remember all the sweetness, all of the times that this person has been so kind to you, etc. When you're really in the grips of this emotion. So you are cognitively incapable. You have a perceptual bias in the terms of the Abhidharma. Because you are feeling hostility, you are incapable of seeing contradictory evidence. So what about it's the same with craving. When you are feeling lust or craving for something, you are incapable of seeing the negative qualities of it. Just cognitively incapable. So that gets to be very interesting. How long do these refractory periods last? Well, Richard Davidson again points out in his research that emotions you can categorize by how long they last. So an emotional state, he says, is very brief, a few seconds, a minute, something like that. And you know exactly what caused it. Somebody cut you off in traffic, or he said something, and of course I responded this way. But it's brief. It lasts a few seconds, a minute, something like that. An emotional state comes and goes. A mood then lasts anywhere from a minute to several minutes, an hour, could be all day, could be even a couple of days that you have a mood. A mood can also become a trait, an emotional trait. So this then an emotional trait could last for a long time. It could be a year or longer. I've been blue for a year. I've been on the edge of simmering. I've been just on the edge of boiling. I've been irritated for a year, it seems, something like that. So during this period that you are, for instance, are experiencing a trait, the threshold for experiencing a state goes down. You're like primed for it. So ambiguous situations that most people would just brush off, if you're on the edge of simmering and a slight irritation arises, you'll be angry like that. The same with a mood. A mood predisposes you to, you lower the threshold for a stimulus that will arouse the anger. Well, the interesting thing about that is that, so during the entire time of an emotional state, you're in a refractory period. So you are incapable of seeing contradictory evidence. You are experiencing a serious cognitive deficit. You're half blind to the world, right? That's interesting. Uh-oh, bad news. A mood also has a refractory period. During the entire time that you are experiencing a mood, you are cognitively incapable of seeing the world accurately, what the world is really presenting to you. So Ekman says the key to emotional health is to begin to add a gap between the spark and the flame, as he calls it. And so that we don't act during the refractory period, that we take a moment to recognize I am under the influence of. So if we just recognize this about our minds, that I am going to be half blind when I am under the influence of a powerful emotion, then you have the more choice about adding a gap before the conflagration. And when we act under the influence of these refractory periods, under the influence of the blindness of a refractory period, it leads to what Ekman in the technical psychological jargon is termed a regrettable episode. So if we act during in the throes of emotion, we can act spontaneously. We can act in the moment and then regret at our leisure. So the key then to adding this refractory period, or to shortening the refractory period, is to add a gap of self-awareness when we recognize that a strong emotion has arisen. Remember Master Shantideva's advice. When you find yourself between the fangs of a mental affliction, what should you do?
Sit like a bump on a log.
Yeah, don't do anything. What should you do? Nothing. Sit like a bump on a log. Be like a stick of wood. Recognize that you're half blind and that there's nothing good going to come out of what you were going to say, what you were going to do. And that everything, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever do anything. It means if you don't do something, you're not going to make the situation worse, and that it's going to pass, that the emotion will pass. Maybe the situation, that spark, that you need to address the situation, but you can do it coolly, calmly, and with compassion, and then everything will be different, won't it? You won't be regretting what you did 3 years from now. It felt so good to get that off my chest. But boy, the fallout. It really does take only a moment of anger, really, doesn't it, to destroy a relationship you took 3 years nurturing. It's so sad. So what we're going to do then is to, in the next meditation that we're going to be doing, is to practice adding that gap of self-awareness. And we're going to be doing just a variation of that meditation that we already did. the taking the mind as the path. So that's the basic tool, because you've got what it takes, obviously, is the stillness of awareness to recognize what's going on. So that these are just mental appearances arising. Ooh, powerful emotion. Yeah, so that's the meditation that we'll be doing. You had a quick question, Hattie?
It was regarding that last thing in terms of the strong emotion. What if the strong emotion is the fear that freezes you?
Well, it would be good to recognize that. Okay? I mean, it's always going to be more beneficial, even with fear, fight or flight. I mean, to be able to do it lucidly is you're always going to be safer. If you recognize, yeah, I'm going to be still now, so a predator doesn't find me. And do it lucidly. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, almost any time that you can be cognitively aware of a powerful emotion. I mean, I can't think of a situation where it might be less beneficial. So, let's just take a quick stretch, and then we'll take a longer break after this meditation. Yeah. So I'm just kind of creating the organization right now, and I have to be doing a training in New York next year for meditators who want to be, help themselves, create little pods around the country. Experienced meditators who then have the kind of psychological tools to help with PTSD with these meditations. I think we get a sense of how powerful this could be for somebody.
Best way to stay informed about what you're doing.
Great. Yeah. I'm going to. Hey, Stephen, could we put do you have a blank sheet of paper that we could, I could get people's emails, so that there are a number of people who would like to be informed of retreats coming up.
Sure.
So I'll get your name on that list. What's your name?
Olga.
Olga.
Yeah.
leave it under the table. Okay.
Great.
This is the time. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks. So find your comfortable position. Again, this is a practice that we will be doing with the stillness of our awareness. Begin by allowing your awareness to illuminate sensations within the body. And allow this awareness to illuminate specifically now the sensations that change as the breath enters and leaves your body. And then apportion your awareness so that your peripheral awareness is aware of the stillness of your awareness. Your awareness being like an unflickering candle flame that illuminates but does not enter into appearances. While the primary awareness illuminates the tactile sensations of breath. as you maintain a peripheral awareness now of the stillness of your awareness, shift that primary awareness to knowing the breath directly, from the tactile to the mental domain. And now, as you maintain a peripheral awareness of the stillness of your awareness, give your primary awareness to the space of the mind and mental appearances that arise there. Let awareness hold its own ground and remain an impassive witness to whatever arises. Be it pleasant or unpleasant, simply let it be without preferring that it be different. Some of these appearances may seem to be objective, as if they are happening over there like dream images. And you are on the curb watching the parade go by. And other appearances may be more subjective. Your response to those appearances. As an exercise now, bring to mind the image of a loved one. This will be more difficult with the distractions in the background. Let's see if you can, while you are bringing to mind this image of a loved one, an objective appearance, is there a subjective response? How do you feel about this image? Does it seem that as long as you're focused on the objective image, that the subjective response remains? Switch now to the subjective response, to the emotional response to this objective image, and take that as a mental appearance that has arisen. It is present. What happens to it? Is it permanent or impermanent? switch back to the object of appearance. Does it refresh the emotional response? And then switch your awareness to the emotional response. When it is only mental appearance, does it change into something else? Perhaps a feeling in the body, a somatic experience. Bring to mind now, as another part of the experiment, the image of someone that you have a dispute with, someone who upset you, maybe even someone who wishes you harm. This is the objective appearance. Do you feel a subjective response? Is it true that as long as you are fixated on the objective, that the subjective response remains? Switch your awareness to the response itself, to the subjective, and what happens? It is a mental appearance that has arisen. If you don't grasp to it, if you are able to remain in impassive witness, if awareness holds its own ground, does even a negative response have a built-in life cycle? Will it dissolve on its own without having to do anything about it? Go back again to the objective image of the person that disturbs you. And imagine that you are just at the point of acting on the emotion that you feel. And now add the gap between the spark and the flame by shifting your awareness to the emotion itself. What happens? The emotion is a mental appearance. It has arisen. It is present. And if you are able to let awareness hold its own ground without grasping to it, it will dissolve. Release the appearances of that experiment now. return to the stillness of awareness. And for a couple of minutes now, simply retain the stillness of awareness while maintaining a primary awareness of the space of the mind and whatever appearances arise there. And if among these appearances an emotional response arises to one of these objective appearances, take that emotional response as the mental appearance. Well, this is a good time to take a lunch break. Maybe the Pentecostal service will be over. So we'll reconvene at 2:15.